Sorry about that, guys. Um, so, David is now on the run, and Saul wants him dead. Like I said, David has been living in the palace up to this point, as part of Saul's court, a court being the people that Saul surrounds himself with, a king or a queen surrounds himself with. So you would think David should go back to Bethlehem. That's where he's from. That's where he lived up until the David and Goliath situation. But that's where he's from. Saul's not stupid. That'll be the first place Saul looks for him. He'll be like, oh, I wonder if David went home to his dad's house. So David's just kind of lost. And just running, and he doesn't really know where he's going. He doesn't have a plan at this point. All right, so we're going to start with 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. That's 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. David came to Nob, to the priest of Ahimelech. Ahimelech came trembling to David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David said to the priest Ahimelech, "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'No one must know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what have you at hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here.' The priest answered David, 'I have no ordinary bread at hand, only holy bread, provided that the young men have kept themselves from women.' David answered the priest, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us as always when I go on expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is a common journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?' So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there except the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord, to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away." All right. So David, not knowing where to go, goes to a priest. And the priest is surprised to see him alone because David is part of Saul's court. He generally travels as part of an entourage. But David basically lies. He's afraid that he might get turned in or turned away. And he says that Saul has trusted him alone with an urgent matter of which no one is to know. That's why he's alone. Basically on his own personal mission for the king, as opposed to, out starting a war against the king. And then he follows that up with, "I'm hungry." Like, yo, haven't eaten in a while. Can I have some food? And the priest is like, "I don't have anything here except holy bread." Holy bread is basically bread that only priests can eat. David basically argues the priest into giving him bread. They kind of have a little theological sparring, saying that, David's saying he hasn't been making himself, he hasn't been sleeping with a lot of women recently, but more important that a mission can be holy, even if it doesn't seem like it on the outside. So, he's not entirely wrong that his mission is, in a way, holy, right? Because he is supposed to be the next king, and God has anointed him and set him up for this. But he is kind of, still taking advantage of this priest and giving him an impression that he's working for Saul, which he's not. So the priest allows it and gives him the bread. All right, so the next section is 1 Samuel 21, 7 through 9. That's 1 Samuel 21, 7 through 9. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there the day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, "Is there no spear or sword here with you? I did not bring my sword or my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." The priest said, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here, wrapped in a cloth, behold, behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none here except that one." David said, "There is none like it. Give it to me." David also has the gall to ask the priest for a weapon. I feel like if you're the priest at this point, you're on a mission for the king. It's so urgent. So urgent you couldn't bring a sword, which you need. Where were you going to get a sword, David? It's not really adding up, right? But I guess the priest doesn't really view it as his place to question the story. So he doesn't have a weapon, but he says that Goliath's weapon is there. The very Goliath that David defeated. David takes it, and it's appropriate because Saul is like a Goliath in that he is very powerful. That he's very powerful and a man that David shouldn't be able to take down. So it's kind of like symbolic, right? Like David versus Goliath again, except it's David versus Saul, because Saul is the institution of Israel. But this time David's going to bring him down with Goliath's own weapon, which Saul wasn't even brave enough to face, right? So, it's like symbolism. But the most important thing in this section is that there's a man named Doeg, I don't know, who sees the whole thing. And Doeg works for Saul. He's the chief of Saul's shepherds. He's also not an Israelite. So what do you think a man loyal to Saul will do when he sees the man Saul wants to kill? Well, on the one hand, he could kill David, but he doesn't do that. He's going to tell the king, right? He's going to tell Saul what he saw. Saul saw. I have a really hard time with that. I think we've talked about that before. He's going to tell Saul what he saw. I tend to add L's to the end of the word, like I saw it, and so I tend to say I saw it, which is very confusing when you're talking about Saul. All right, so David leaves this place and goes to a couple of different cities, gathering to him men who are loyal to him. Meanwhile, Saul is looking for him. This is kind of really interesting, right? Because in any other scenario where you don't know that David is God's anointed one, you're like, why are these guys following David? It's kind of like it is a coup, right? Except not quite, because they're not successful yet. It's more like a civil war is what is starting here. And so David knows he's chosen by God. Maybe some of these men trust that. But there are men on Saul's side who know that Saul was chosen by God at one point. So, this is a situation where, other than Saul, everyone thinks they're doing the right thing, right? Doeg is not, from his perspective, he doesn't know David is the anointed one of God. He knows that Saul is the king. Saul was the one chosen. So he's doing the right thing from his own point of view. Which makes things complicated. Life is complicated. All right, so David leaves this place, gathers all these guys. Saul is looking for him. So 1 Samuel 21, 11 through 15. The king sent for the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and for all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. Saul said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub." He answered, "Here I am, my lord." Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, by giving him bread and a sword, and by inquiring of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait, as he is doing today?" Then Ahimelech answered the king, "Who among all your servants is so faithful as David? He is the king's son-in-law, and is quick to do your bidding, and is honored in your house. Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? By no means. Do not let the king impute anything to a servant, or to any member of my father's house, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little." So, Saul, he hears that this priest helped David, and he's basically like, "Why did you help him? He's trying to overthrow and kill me, right?" And the priest is like, "What? No. David is your servant? He works for you." As far as the priest knows, that's accurate, right? He also points out David is Saul's son-in-law, which is true. David's married to one of Saul's daughters. The priest is just overall confused because he didn't know David was a threat. He thought David was a trusted member of the court, which is totally what David took advantage of several verses earlier, right? So is Saul going to accept this answer? Saul never told the priest that David was an enemy. Well, we'll see. 1 Samuel 22, 16 through 19. 1 Samuel 22, 16 through 19. The king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." The king said to the guard who stood around him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David. They knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me." But the servants of the king would not raise their hand to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, "You, Doeg, turn and attack the priests." Doeg the Edomite turned and attacked the priests. On that day he killed 85 who wore the linen ephod. Nob, the city of priests, he put to the sword. Men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkeys, and sheep he put to the sword. So now, Saul's not going to forgive him. So Saul orders the guards to kill the priests. Saul is literally ordering the priest to be killed because the priest did his job by helping someone he thought was the king's helper and by praying for him. The guards, however, are like, "What? You want me to kill a priest? This is a bad idea. I'm not killing a priest of God." But Doeg is willing to kill the priests. The Bible points out every time it mentions this guy that he's an Edomite. What is an Edomite? Well, first off, it means he's not an Israelite. It can be confusing if you're not keeping track of everything in your head, because, you'll hear people referred to as like Saul, the Benjaminite. And you're like, well, does that mean Saul's not an Israelite? And no, Saul is an Israelite, right? Or David, the Judite. David is an Israelite. But because Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, Gad, these are all tribes of Israel, of which there are 12. Edom is not a tribe of Israel. So the Bible goes to great lengths to point this out because he's not an Israelite. And so a non-Israelite here is willing to kill the priests of God because he doesn't have the same religion. He doesn't have the same upbringing. He's loyal to Saul. He may not be thinking he may not know the law. He may not be familiar with the religion. And he's just like, the king told me to do this, so I'm going to do this. Why is this non-Israelite hanging out with the Israelites? Well, Edomites and Israelites are actually related. They're all descended from Abraham. Edomites are descendants of Esau. If you remember, Israel means you're a descendant of Jacob. Jacob and Esau were twin brothers. So Israelites and Edomites live in the same area, but they aren't considered outsiders the same way like Philistines are, right? So they're not part of the chosen people, but they're not like a super outsider. So anyway, in the end, all these priests are totally killed. A bunch of people in the town are killed, men, women, and children. Even the animals are killed, which, I always question that. Why? Just take the donkeys. Why would you kill them? I mean, I question killing babies too. That seems stupid. But, I'm just like, what? The animals have no loyalties. Either, like, whatever. Anyway, continuing on. 1 Samuel 22, 20 through 23. 1 Samuel 22, 20 through 23. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, 'I am responsible for the lives of all your father's house. Stay with me and do not be afraid. For the one who seeks my life seeks your life. You will be safe with me.'" So, one of the priests, the original priest we were talking about, his son, escapes the massacre and he goes to find David. And he tells David everything that happened. And David blames himself. Why? He didn't kill the men. He doesn't even blame himself because he took refuge with them. He knew that wasn't wrong. But he blames himself because he had known Doeg was there. And that Doeg was basically a spy of Saul's. And he didn't do anything about it. He could have stopped it, whether by killing him or taking him hostage. But David just saw him and did nothing. He was more concerned about himself at that point. The act of killing the priests is still Saul's fault, but David knows he could have done something that could have prevented it. All right, so skipping ahead quite a bit. This is 22. We're skipping ahead to 23. I guess it's not quite a bit. It's only a couple verses. So 1 Samuel 23, 1 through 5. 1 Samuel 23, 1 through 5. Now they told David, "The Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors." David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" The Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Look, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" Then David inquired of the Lord again. The Lord answered him, Yes, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hands. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought with the Philistines, brought away their livestock, and dealt them a heavy defeat. Thus David rescued the inhabitants of Keilah. So, the Philistines are attacking the city, Keilah. We said it like 12 times in those 5 verses. And David is told about it. Like a good leader, he asks God what he should do. On the one hand, David is basically a fugitive, hiding. And if he went to protect the city, it would definitely expose him to Saul. Or at least Saul would know where he is. So he's like, should I stay hiding or should I protect my fellow Israelites? And God is like, go, protect them. Duh. You're going to be their king one day. You might as well start now. But David's men are basically like, what? We're fugitives. We can't do that. And we're having a hard time here in our homeland where we're like of the people. Imagine against the Philistines. They're just going to straight kill us. They're scared. So David takes their concern back to God. He's like, God, the men, they're very distressed. What do you want me to do? And God is just like, dude, I already told you what to do. I have your back. If you fight, I ensure you will win. I will give the Philistines into your hand. Which is exactly what happens. David leads his men. They go defeat the Philistines, and Keilah is saved. Yeah, except they're still fugitives. All right, 1 Samuel 23, 7 through 8. And let me drink a little bit of my tea. Okay. 1 Samuel 23, 7 through 8. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah. And Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. So sure enough, Saul hears David has rescued Keilah and is in that town. So he's like, aha, now I have David. He's in a town, so I will lay siege to that town until David and his men come out. So if you don't know what besieging or sieging or laying siege means, it basically means surrounding a place and keeping anything or anyone from coming in and out, while also often attacking the town and trying to get in. So it's a little more intense than just like the Trade Federation's blockade in episode 1. At the beginning, it'd be more like when the Trade Federation is blockading and they send troops on the ground, right? They're sieging Nabu. So here they are going to siege Keilah, right? So why is blockading or sieging such a big deal? Why was Queen Amidala so worried about being blockaded by the Trade Federation? You didn't know I was going to make so many episode 1 comparisons, did you? But it's always a danger in Sunday school. All right, so it's a big deal because a lot of these towns relied on produce from nearby farms or water from nearby rivers. And if they couldn't get any of those things, the town would starve. Even in more modern senses with, blockades, we weren't sieging Cuba. There was no attacking. But we were, for a long time, we banned trade with Cuba, which it wasn't really a blockade. A blockade implies you have it surrounded. But even in a modern era, banning trade means that you can only use what you produce. And even here in America, we have a lot of stuff that if you look at it, you'll be like, oh, where was this made? Not in America, right? We rely on each other for things. And it would be even worse back then. Because at least, we are capable of producing our own food, right? But what if somebody sieged Albuquerque? Right? Albuquerque doesn't have farms inside of it. We have the Rio Grande. We have the water table. So we'd probably be fine in a water sense. But it wouldn't take long before we didn't have any food left if they weren't letting the trucks come in that deliver the food to our grocery stores. So it's a big deal to siege a city. So Saul is basically thinking that if he sieges Keilah, David will come out to save everyone. He'll give himself up. This is a brutal move because the people who live in Keilah are Israelites. And Saul is showing over and over that he is willing to kill his own people if that's what it takes to get to David. I mean, he killed all those priests in that whole town, men, women, and children, right? They didn't even help David. They didn't even know David was there. He's just like going total war on his own people. The people of Keilah didn't actually even pick a side in this war. No more did the random priests in Nob, right? They were being attacked by the Philistines. And then David saved them. What are they to do, right? They are between, the Philistines, who are an enemy, and someone who is their own people coming to save them, who they know. I mean, they may not even know David is a fugitive. So Saul is basically going to punish them for being the victims in this situation. Next section, 1 Samuel 23, 9 through 14. First Samuel 23, 9 through 14. When David learned that Saul was plotting evil against him, he said to the priest Abiathar, "Bring the ephod here." David said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. And now will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, I beseech you, tell your servant." The Lord said, "He will come down." Then David said, "Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul?" The Lord said, "They will surrender you." Then David and his men, who were about 600, set out and left Keilah. They wandered wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped Keilah, he gave up the expedition. David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but the Lord did not give him into his hands. So, when David hears Saul's coming to attack him, to attack the city, to get to him, he's basically like, "God, is Saul really going to kill this innocent city to get to me?" And God's like, "Yep." And David is like, well, will the people of Keilah give me up to Saul to protect themselves, or will they protect me? And God's like, they're totally going to give you up, dude. Sorry. Now, once again, I don't want you to think too poorly of these people here, because remember, they were just attacked by the Philistines, and now their own king is coming to attack them. Giving up David is a move that will save the most lives, but it's also, as far as they know, the right move, right? Saul is their king. And David doesn't really seem to blame them either, because basically David and his army, they just leave. It takes a while for armies to move, and Saul's army is going to be pretty big and slow. David's men are going to be a little more agile because there's a lot less of them, and they're going to be a lot less formal, more like guerrillas, right? Like guerrilla warfare. Sorry, guerrilla with a UE, not a gorilla like an ape. Like, war gorillas. It is weird that those words are so similar. I don't know. I'll have to look up the etymology. So David and his people leave before Saul's army can even get there. And when Saul hears that David escaped before he even got there, he just gives up on the whole journey to Keilah. He's like, it's not worth going out there. Instead, they go back to this cat and mouse game in the wilderness, where David is hiding and Saul is trying to find him. But God still has David's back because Saul doesn't find him. I mean, it's kind of like a needle in a haystack thing, right? In both of these stories, we see that Saul is slowly losing touch with what it means to be a good king in his anger at David. He's willing to sacrifice his own country, his own people, if it means taking David down. David, on the other hand, came to the aid of Keilah, even though he knew it meant Saul would find him. David is acting more kingly than Saul before he even becomes king. And that's actually the end of today's lesson, which is pretty short. I don't remember why we made these lessons shorter. I know sometimes it's because we had different things going on. But next week, we're going to continue discussing this and see how David and Saul's battle continues. So I'm going to stop the recording.